Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to thank and pay our respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Sero Boost, the Happiness Science Insights podcast, produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Lou Ngo, coming to your ears from Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. Let's learn together. Hello and welcome to the show, Maggie Hamilton. It's so lovely for you to join us today.
It's a real pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Now, for audience members, for anyone watching or listening, I am not Lou Ngo, who is your usual host. My name is Aditi Kutty. I'm standing in for Lou while she's unable to take this episode at the moment. So I have the pleasure of talking to you about loneliness today, and I'm really, really excited about our conversation.
Lovely, me too.
Fantastic. Now, you are a writer, a social researcher, and a former publisher. Do you mind just telling us a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, so most of my working life I've worked in book publishing, and that culminated in being a publisher myself and having my own imprint, which was lovely. And I've written over a dozen books now. And what fires me to write and to research is very much, I care about what's happening on the planet. I find people fascinating. I find trying to understand what makes us tick fascinating. And I'm really passionate about the future and how we craft a better future. So I'm never afraid to look at the bits that we're not doing well, because I think if we go around all the time saying we're wonderful, we're fabulous, there's no growth. We have to dare to look at those bits that aren't working personally and collectively. I'm passionate about community, and yes, I love traveling to out-of-way places on the planet and experiencing very different cultures, because I find they feed me personally, but also they're a great mirror back to what we're doing well in the West, but mostly what we're not doing well. I find them sources of great inspiration and very humbling to travel to these cultures and experience their ways of being in the world. And I just think it's a shame that in the West, we're not more curious about that. We're not the pinnacle of human achievement.
Yeah, that's something that I feel like is not, I feel like it needs to be drilled into us as children, that people experience the world in so many different ways and there's no right or wrong answer to them. But there's a lot that we can all learn from each other.
Definitely, definitely.
Now, we have a segment now called Have You Met Maggie Hamilton, in which I ask you a couple of questions about yourself and we can get to know you. And you don't have to think too hard because they're very simple questions.
Great.
Fantastic. So what is your favorite book?
Look, I have a number of, hundreds of books that I love deeply. But my favorite, I think, is a book called Anam Cara by John O'Donoghue. And he's a former Catholic priest who studied the Celts and their way of being in the world of seeing. And he was kind of a mystical man. He died not long ago. He has a global following. And he has a great way of nudging into those difficult places on the human path. You know, those times when we feel despairing, or we've lost our vision, or we've lost someone we love, or what we thought would make us happy isn't making us happy. And so he translates, in a way, the Celtic world for us in the most powerful and beautiful way. And I go back to that book again and again for inspiration because it's so deep and so immediate and so out of the box, which I also love.
Yeah, sounds like a really good combination of all those things. What about a favorite movie? Do you have a favorite movie?
Um, I have a number of favourite movies. One of them is Gandhi, which is a number of years old now. I'm very fascinated by the figures that change history, but do so in a way that isn't conventional. So there we had this little diminutive Indian man who'd been a lawyer who gave it all away to fight for Indian independence and who walked a path, I believe, of great integrity. And he did it without, armies, without weaponry. And he opened people's hearts and minds to new possibilities. And it never fails to move me and again remind me there are different ways of achieving what we can achieve. And the big issues, every generation has massive issues. When, we like to feel that we're at the peak of all difficulties on the planet. Well, that's rubbish. Yes, we do have some big issues. So I think it's great to look at the lives of those who've walked before and have done it well and successfully. And so, yes, I love Gandhi as a film.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's the Ben Kingsley,
Yes,
um, Richard Attenborough directed. Yeah, no, I think
yeah,
that history is such an important teacher for the
yes.
problems of today, and people just, for whatever reason, never think about that
No,
or
we've
look at
got,
it that way.
absolutely, we've got to have perspective. And as Santayana said, those who don't learn the lessons of history are doomed to repeat them. And we don't want to have to keep, repeating the painful bits. It's not a good idea.
Yeah, yeah, definitely not a good idea. What about a podcast that you've been listening to lately?
I can't isolate an individual podcast that has really stood out amongst the others. I mean, what I love about podcasts is that it reminds me of being a little girl when my father used to read to me. And that thing of just sitting and listening to a voice is something I love deeply. But I'm sorry I can't isolate one at the moment that was. I tend to listen to a lot of current affairs podcasts.
Yep, yep. Listen to all podcasts, including this one is the takeaway, I guess, from that one.
Absolutely.
Um, yeah. Do you have a famous role model that you've looked up to?
Yes, it's Mandela. I was lucky enough to meet Mandela about 20 years ago in a small gathering, and a number of things struck me. One was his immense humility. One was his immense. He's an incredibly powerful presence, but so gentle, like gentle beyond belief. And he's a great believer in kindness, which I am. And I've come to realize that kindness is a great act of power, that you have to be in a place of balance and self-understanding to a level to be able to walk the world with the kindness he was able to walk. And the other thing that moved me is after years in chains, walking was painful for him, but he gave no indication of that. I mean, he didn't sit down and say, oh, my poor legs or anything like that. So to continue to walk the world after all those years of terrible imprisonment and not just want to put his feet up and live, being kind of pampered a bit, which you could understand him doing, but to get up and to continue to do things that mattered, to me, it's a great strength of spirit that can do that. And I think what he's
Yeah,
also
yeah.
taught me, which I've learned through meditation and other things, is that silence is a great teacher. And, you know, he had a lot of time in solitary. And I feel that was a very powerful, some people can't cope with that, but I suspect he used that silence to really get to know himself and the nature of existence. And that takes a lot of courage. So, yes, Mandela's a huge hero of mine.
Yeah, I'm sure he's a huge hero for a lot of people who are listening as well. They could probably, but it's really interesting to hear about the different ways that people connect with the same figure. I
Yes,
think that's pretty cool.
yes. I
Yeah.
remember one
Yeah.
day when Arnie Schwarzenegger had got he was the governor, made governor of California. And I remember waking up and hearing this and kind of rolling my eyes and thinking, you know, what's next? And one of the first people to congratulate him in the world was Nelson Mandela, and that pulled me up. And I thought, when we
Right.
have generosity of spirit, we actually encourage people to be the best they can be, not the worst by being defensive. And it was a real lesson. I felt quite chastened by that.
Yeah, absolutely. What about, and final question in this segment, what about the last course that you completed?
That I've enjoyed.
That you
Um,
completed?
the last course I completed generally,
Yeah,
not the one I
yeah,
enjoyed
yeah, in
most.
general.
Sorry, I
No, no,
see.
no, in general. Yeah, that's all good.
Um, I study a lot of wise people from Indigenous traditions, and I've just finished one recently, and he's a South American medicine man, and I can't pronounce his name. It's a one of these complex Peruvian names, but a very powerful teacher about ecology and our place in relation to, you know, all the creatures on Earth and our own inner ecology.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So much we can learn from, like you were saying earlier, so much we can learn from other cultures that are not ours, and their way
Yes.
of seeing things.
And I have a great hunger for
But
that
that brings us,
because, sorry, I was going to say, these wisdoms can so easily be lost in these times.
yeah, absolutely. It really, really can. I think especially these days when people are so willing to go into the city and, you know, make a living that way. But we'll talk. I think we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a bit. That does bring us to the end of our segment where we've gotten to know you now. So now hopefully our listeners have made a connection with you, and we can move on to our interview segment where we talk about the topic of the day, which is loneliness. Now, on our show, we do like to ask a couple of overarching questions. It is about happiness. So I was wondering, what does happiness mean to you? How would you define happiness?
I think happiness is in being in a state of peace, a state of balance, and a state of connectedness. And that is nothing to do with the kind of happy culture that we're marketed to 24/7. This is a place that's much deeper from which we can operate, that enables us then to connect inwards, because I feel that is one of the core reasons we are lonely, because we don't know who we are. So how can we know what feeds us? And enables us to connect out in a way that is meaningful to other people, so that we can live in this space of peacefulness, which gives us clarity for ourselves and the way we can be in the world with others, and in a way that's less conflict and more joy.
Yeah, yeah, that definitely makes a lot of sense. And you talked a little bit earlier about how, you know, what people kind of tend to get wrong about what you think happiness is not, which is kind of that happy kind of culture. What do you
Yes.
think people get wrong about happiness?
Well, I think because we're sold to, and look, billions are spent daily to persuade us to be this kind of person in the world, that kind of person. You know, we have our influencers and social media and 1,000 other things tugging at us daily. And what we have to realize is that most of that stuff does not feed the depths of our being. And so therefore we chase after aspirations that are given to us. We chase after possessions that are given to us. And I'm not saying we can't take pleasure in, shopping and finding something we love. I'm not saying that. I'm talking about it when it becomes manic, when there's a kind of frenzied need to constantly be doing these things. And I'm very aware of this because early in my career, I was successful early in publishing, and I was doing everything that everybody, you're supposed to be doing to make you happy. And I was really seriously miserable. And it was a terrible shock to me. I was late 20s at the time because I was ticking all the boxes. But then, of course, I began to realize I was ticking the wrong boxes, that we have to nurture that place within. We have to get to know ourselves profoundly. And that's to look at the uncomfortable bits as well as the comfortable bits, and to constantly work on ourselves through life, to grow and to challenge what we're doing so that we can be a better version of ourselves. And that is the problem, that the better version we're offered is cosmetic. And then we wonder why we've got so much anxiety and depression and entitlement, because those three things are linked. Entitlement is a great indicator that somebody is deeply unhappy.
It's kind of understanding what is actually important to you as opposed to what society has conditioned us to feel is important.
Yes, and when we look at the studies on happiness, and of which there are many, we find some really interesting things. We find that that a little of what we love regularly does us good. And my mother used to say that, years back. So, if joy for us is going out and getting an almond croissant on Saturday morning with the dog, then don't feel you have to go to every pastry shop in Sydney and try every single pastry. I'm not saying don't try other pastries, but return to that thing that brings you a quiet joy. And there is something about the anticipation of something we already love that warms our space rather than the frenetic, following everybody in Insta and having to be, the first person to try the new patisserie. It's almost like we've got so much choice, we're lost in it, and it causes a confusion. So we need to simplify. Happiness has a simplicity to it. And if life is complex, then there is part of the answer. Simplify what you're doing.
Yeah, that's such a beautiful, beautiful way of putting it. I guess moving on to kind of zooming into our topic, which is loneliness. How do you define loneliness? What is loneliness to you?
Loneliness is disconnection. And it's important we understand this because we tend to have this vision of people sitting alone in their bedroom sobbing, feeling unpopular. Popularity has absolutely nothing to do with loneliness. And in fact, studies about popularity show that that is a very fleeting thing, and that leads to anxiety and depression ultimately. Happiness is about, loneliness, is about being connected to who we are and being connected to the world around us. And if we are indulging in habits that disconnect us, and this is why I like to talk a lot about habits to do with loneliness, because I like people to realize that loneliness is just a series of bad habits disconnecting habits that we've fallen into. So it's not some huge mountain we have to climb. It's just a series of steps to start to undo those bad habits of disconnection and discover the joy of reconnection, because connecting is joyful. And that doesn't mean people in our lives 24/7, but it means when we do connect, it is meaningful. And it might just be a smiling at a stranger as we walk down the street, or saying hello to a neighbor. Tiny moments of connection.
Sometimes it's those little things that can make such a big difference.
Yes.
So where does solitude come into this? Are solitude and loneliness the same thing?
No, they're not. And I'm really glad you've asked that question, because solitude is the ability to be by oneself in a way that does start that feeding process of what we need inside ourselves. And in fact, the practice of solitude, I think, is very important, particularly in contemporary life where there's so much happening around us all the time. So whereas loneliness is a depleting experience, solitude is actually an experience that feeds and inspires. And it's often in solitude, even if it's, and it doesn't have to be huge batches of solitude, where we often get inspiration for new ways of doing things. You know, people often talk about, oh, I was just taking the dog a walk along the beach, or I was in the shower when and it's that moment of solitude that allows new ideas, allows vision, opportunities, possibilities to come into our life. So solitude's very valuable. It's a very juicy thing to be involved in.
Mm-hmm. Would you say that solitude is intentional where loneliness isn't?
Yes, I think so. Absolutely. I don't think people deliberately want to be lonely, even if they're introverted. I don't think that's necessarily the case. And I think also, you know, as we talked a minute ago about loneliness being bad habits we've fallen into, solitude in a way is one of the good habits. So it can actually become something that we integrate into our daily or weekly routine. And of course, one of the great opportunities with that is meditation, where you are sitting in solitude for meditation. And, you know, for many people, including myself, that's a daily practice. So it is a good practice. It's a nourishing practice.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good way of putting it. How does social media come into this? Because, you know, the loneliness is still a pretty big issue with the younger
Yeah.
generations, but they're all on social media. They're constantly in contact with other people in the outside world. Does social media help or hinder in
Look, I think
this?
it can do both. I think there are times when, if you have disparate groups of people who feel, you know, perhaps it's somebody living in the country who's gay or whatever, who feels very different from the people around them, and thankfully that's changing. Social media can be a great solace to join a group of people who you feel you're in tune with. So it can be wonderful. And in many ways, you know, connecting families across the planet, there are loads of good things about social media. But social media is also very addictive, and it gives us the illusion of intimacy, whereas intimacy requires more of us than social media can often deliver. And at the core of loneliness is feeling we're not seen or heard deeply, that when someone's with us, they're really getting us, they're really hearing what we're saying. And social media encourages very superficial exchanges. In fact, we know from research, if we're having a drink with somebody and one of us or both of us has our mobile phones on the table, even if it's face downwards, that flattens the conversation. And by that I mean it makes it more superficial, because subconsciously we know sooner or later someone's going to text or phone and we're going to be interrupted. So even at that level of connecting with somebody, just the presence of a device can actually create issues. And of course, we now have a generation of kids who are growing up in their bedrooms on their devices, where when it comes to school holiday and they have friends in the same suburb, they'd rather connect in their bedrooms on social media than get out and see each other, meet somewhere locally and chat and have a walk or do whatever they want to do. They'd rather do it on social media. And what that is creating is seriously bad habits, not only of loneliness in the sense of feeling lonely and not understood, but there are skills to being able to communicate with others and for others to feel like, yes, that person really understands me. They really heard what I said. And particularly when people are in difficult situations, if we're sitting with someone who's dying, if we're sitting with someone who's lost their job, and that means they're going to have to leave their accommodation or they can't feed their families, they need people who can seriously listen, not somebody who can just say, oh, that's really bad. We need to be able to learn in life how to deal with these difficult moments and to be able to sit with them in a way that is meaningful to us and other people. And that's, of course, character growth. And that's not something we learn overnight, but these are skills that are absolutely needed. And I remember reading when the bushfires were on the East Coast a couple of years ago, and they were blazing. I was reading the Sydney Morning Herald, and this young mum was saying, everybody got evacuated to this local school. The whole place is burning around them and they've got no idea what's happened to their animals, neighbours, their possessions, everything. So terrifying. Could hardly breathe with the amount of smoke. And this young mother said the saving grace for her was an older lady in her 70s who went round and comforted everybody. Now, that is the sign of somebody who is deeply connected to other people around them, and also just how profound your presence can be, even if you only have a short conversation with somebody, to feel so loved and reassured in a terrifying moment. And that's the sort of thing we need to all aim for, are those skills, not just being kind and so forth to friends and people who are like us, but to be able to stretch that to be that with people who are very different from us, from complete strangers, to be able to create something around us and within us that people feel they can connect profoundly with. And that's what changes society. That's what kicks us out of loneliness. Not hiding in our bedroom on our devices, while the beauty and extraordinary colour of life is happening somewhere outside.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think the interactions we have with people on social media release quite the same chemicals in our brains that
No,
interaction with a real human being does.
that's absolutely right. And we know that. We know that from our own experiences. We know that from many research. And, life is ultimately happening in real life. And we've got to remember that in all its beauty and colour and diversity. Human beings, nature, cultures, everything. We have so much richness to embrace. Why would we hide away from all that? Why would we sell ourselves short? But we do. So we've fallen into these bad habits. And so we've got to stop Uber eating all the time. One of the things we know is that eating together really works on those feel-good chemicals. And we can perhaps talk about a few little methods later on, simple things we can do to get that juiciness going again.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll definitely be speaking to some of those later. But I guess my next question is that you mentioned in your book, When We Become Strangers, how loneliness sneaks into our lives and what we can do about it, that parenting right now is different.
Yeah.
Children are not making the same connections with their family and with nature. And I think especially, those kids who were born in lockdown or spent their youngest years in lockdown, they probably feel it the most. How do you think our childhood plays a role in our tendency to feel older as an adult, less lonely, sorry, as an adult?
Well, childhood is when our patterns are set down for us. And of course, these are patterns that can be changed. But if we have good patterns, then we're ahead of the game. In fact, that's one of the most important things we can take into adult life. But parenthood is really hard. I mean, it's always been a challenge with different challenges for each generation. But one of the things now is that parents are so busy and so stressed. And, again, they're marketed to that providing stuff for kids is what love's about. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. And what we now know is that children are lacking touch and they're lacking being held. One of the things that I mentioned at the beginning was my father was a lovely big Scotsman, and I used to love to sit on his knee and having him read to me because he had this wonderful voice that would reverberate through me when he was reading a story. Simple things like that, so not just sitting on the bed and reading to your child, but actually getting into bed with them or sitting on the bed with them and allowing them to cuddle up to you. If you are watching stuff, then having children cuddle up to you. We are physical beings and we need that touch. And what we're now finding is that children who are lacking touch are now experiencing some of the medical conditions that only elderly people were once experienced, like fibromyalgia, where you have extreme sensitivity. So even sitting down or something can be painful. It's almost like any form of contact with other things is painful, amongst other things. So touch is really important. I was of a generation where, we just came back for meal times, and I know things have changed, but the wonder of that was most of our childhood was spent, climbing trees, in gardens, digging in the dirt. It didn't matter how dirty we got, and having adventures in nature. And what we now know is that so many of our children are not getting outside, as we talked about earlier. In fact, there's a British study that came out a while ago that actually said that British prisoners were getting more time outside a day than British kids. And, here in Australia, we can kind of feel a bit smug about that with our outdoorsy nation. But I wonder how many of our children spend an hour a day outside every day of the week. And I suspect that doesn't happen. So we need to do this because touch also and being outside, climbing, doing all those things, it teaches children spatial awareness, their ability to cut things, tie their own shoelaces, pardon me, put on socks. All these things are skills they need to learn. And we have children going to preschool who cannot hold a pencil because they're not used to holding things steady. And these are all skills we all take for granted, but each one of these has to be learned. And of course, there's a most wonderful book called The Last Child in the Wood, and that talks about what they call nature deficit disorder. And with that, we have children who are terrified of nature, go absolutely crazy when they see an insect, instead of being fascinated by it, intrigued by it. And here we are with all these climate issues, and we can talk about ecology as a kind of intellectual thing, but what we need is to be having an active relationship with nature so it means something to us, so that we're part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's so true. And I guess speaking of, earlier I mentioned COVID, but through lockdown, people are moving to working from home. We're being isolated from our colleagues. We're being isolated from our friends. We're less likely to say yes to going out now. And part of that, there's good reason for it. The pandemic isn't technically over, but part of it, it does make you wonder, as a community, how do we regain that sense of shared connection and belongingness?
I love that question because, we talk about the bad habits that have tipped us into loneliness. So it's the little habits that work for us. I live in an apartment. My husband and I now live in an apartment block, and we do things like have potluck suppers where we just invite a group of neighbours round. Everybody brings a dish, and we sit and we talk and we enjoy. And that's people across different ages. And because everybody brings a dish, we don't have that whole dinner party thing where everybody's, cooking till all ridiculous hours trying to pretend that their home's a restaurant. And so it doesn't have to be a meal. It can be just getting together for a coffee. But it is having these little rituals in the day and the week. A girlfriend of mine lived in a share house for years and then bought her own place. And for the next couple of decades, they would meet every Friday because they'd all gone their separate ways in the city. They'd meet at a certain cafe at a certain time. Now, not everybody could come because of work commitments every week, but they're now friends of 40 years, and they're an incredible family. Virtually none of them were Australian born, but they have this incredible closeness that began with them being in that share house all those years ago. Another thing is Meetup, which is a great platform to find people in your area who have the same passions as you do. And the other thing for me, which I'm extremely passionate about, is getting out in nature. Go and spend time in a park you love, because time in nature refreshes us. We are sensory beings, and most of us in the West, our senses are completely shut down, and nature brings those alive. We hear, we smell, we see, and we only have to have 20 minutes in nature, and we come back and we feel completely refreshed. We have a street one over from us, and the jacarandas are out at the moment, and it's the most wonderful little street, and the trees meet in the middle, and it's like this green cathedral for most of the year. And then at this time of the year, we have this beautiful sensory experience of the colour, that honeysuckle smell you get in dawn and dusk with the jacarandas, and people come from all over to take photos and just walk down that street. If only they realised consciously how much nature feeds us, they'd spend more time out there. And another thing about this is part of loneliness, I believe, is our devices, in a sense, scrambling our brains. And there was this wonderful piece of research done in New York where people were given all this difficult mental stuff to be doing online. And then half the sample, they were up on high rise, looked out over just a view over New York, the sky, the roof lines of New York. And the other half looked out over a rooftop garden. And those who looked out over the rooftop garden, within 40 seconds, their brains had been refreshed. 40 seconds just looking at nature, just extraordinary. So, there's lots of ways we can start to turn things around by little good habits that bring us joy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess speaking about, those habits, and how do we know, what are the skills you think are important for us to build that deeper connection, and how do we go about practicing those skills?
I think it's about actually having a commitment to ourselves and getting to know ourselves better. And one of the great ways to do that, of course, is meditation. And there are literally thousands of guided meditations. you can get now. I mean, when I began meditation, it was seen as a very weird thing. But the first meditation I had, I just felt that sense of expansiveness and peace. And I thought, this is the space I want to live my life in. So I was very motivated. So it's about tiny pieces of time, understanding that tiny pieces of time in the activities that feed us can deliver huge rewards. I think one of the things we've made everything incredibly complex, and it's almost like if we haven't done a degree in meditating, we can't do it, or if it doesn't work every time, we give it up. But it's about creating little routines in the day. I mean, one of the things I always did at work, and of course, like everybody, I've been working from home the last few years. I would actually drive to work the more scenic route when I could, which was only added 5 minutes to the journey because it brought me joy. And so it's actually paying attention to those little things that bring us joy. I would get to work early because I've written books while having very busy, full-on jobs for quite a number of years. And so I would get to work early. I would find that funny little cafe that I loved, often the least trendy cafe near where I worked, which usually was run by people who had such heart, and I knew I wouldn't be disturbed there. And then I'd sit and write for 20 minutes. And that was how so many of my books were written for years. But that time at the cafe was also my sacred time before I began the day. And I like to use the word sacred or holy time, because those are the times that feed us and make us whole. And that's what sacred is. It's whole. It's bringing us into wholeness. It's not anything. I mean, we can strip back the layers of that, but keeping it at its simple and start to see time with people we love as sacred. And so all my friends now, if we're having a pasta, they'll text me whatever. When can we have a sacred pasta? Or if it's a coffee, when are we having our sacred coffee? Or when are we having our next sacred breakfast? Everybody, in my friendship group, all call it sacred. And that's because that time together is very replenishing, and it does make us feel more whole. And it's special time. So it doesn't have to be complex. And also we need to find our sacred places in the city or town where we live. Those places that uplift us. For me, it's graveyards. For me, it's places in nature. In Sydney, there's the Angel Chapel at St. James, which is the dearest little chapel under the church, full of paintings of angels. And I just love to go to that little chapel. It's one of the great secrets of Sydney. So we find these places and, we might just spend 10 minutes there. But when we are there, we are 100% there. And that is the key. We're not looking at our devices, and we're just coming into that place of stillness and silence. And then we're replenished, and then we can get out there and do all the stuff that 21st century demands of us.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's kind of what leans into what you were saying earlier about solitude versus loneliness. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
So I guess moving on to our practice/habit experiment debrief, what is a practice that you would recommend or you do yourself to deal with loneliness?
Well, I have my favourite places in nature that I go to close by, and I go there consciously seeing them as sacred places for me. And one is a beach in Sydney called Neilson Park. It has amazing fig trees, and from the moment I went there, it was love at first sight. And I love it particularly in winter because selfishly there's very few people there. But there is a little cafe where you can get a coffee. And often I'll just grab a coffee and I'll go and sit under one of the figs and just watch the waves. And sometimes, even in winter, I'll take my boots and socks off and roll up my jeans and I'll just walk in the water a little bit, and I'll just be in that place. And it's one of those beaches where those wonderful elderly people, you know, who can swim all year round, are there. And one day, years back, one of the old ladies who does this, who I'm always in great admiration for, because I like my water to be warmer before I swim, she asked me to mind her car keys, because they'd had a spate of people nicking car keys while people were swimming, which wasn't much fun. So I did this, and we got talking, got to know each other, and she said, "You really love this place, don't you, Maggie?" And I said, "Yes, it's my sacred place." And she smiled. And her mother, it had been her mother's beach before her, so that family probably had 120 years experience of that beach. And she said to me, "You know what the Indigenous people call this place?" And I said, "No." She said, "The healing place." And I thought, isn't it interesting when we pay attention to what feeds us? It's like that inner magnet takes us to the places that are healing for us. And so for me, the practice of being with the people who feed me, the places that feed me, the activities, ballet, you know, film, theatre, being with people I love, then we elevate them by seeing them as sacred. And so it amplifies what we're able to access in these experiences. And it enables, we know when we've hit it, because they make us feel more alive, more joyful, more in that deep sense of the word.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's such a beautiful way of putting it, because I often think about, when you were talking about, feeling like connected to the world when you're around nature,
Yes,
when you're feeling kind of connected to the world around nature, I think about, when I go hiking, and I don't have any
absolutely.
devices, nothing, and it's just complete silence. And I feel I'm not a religious person, because I just don't have much of a personal concept of spirituality. But when I'm kind of just by myself in those quiet spaces, it makes me feel like maybe there is something out there that I can be connected to. And I think it's a really beautiful feeling.
Yes, and I think that's what sacred is about. You know, we've overlaid it with all these other things, but basically it's about wholeness as a human being. So what makes us a whole human being? And I do have an alert about this, is that once you start to find these things, then they become compulsive in the best way possible.
Absolutely. Yeah, that does. That's a bit of a warning. What are the challenges with this practice?
You know, I think the problem is that there are always people in our lives who take up a lot of time, and it's always the same people with the same problems, and you could tell them there's the script they're about to tell you because you've heard it so many times. And when I'm not being mindful, people and experiences that drain me, I allow myself to be drained when I should be having more barriers around time spent in those pursuits. I'm not saying you drop friends who are difficult by any means, but it is about being aware. And like everybody else, I slip into those habits. And then that's when I feel drained and discouraged and feel scratchy with myself and others. I never feel that way when I'm in the flow and I'm doing things that feed me. And then it is my pleasure to be with those people. And they seem to be in a better space because I'm in a better space. You know, it's like that space when you come back from holidays, you know, and go into work and people start to tell you all the dramas they've had while you've been away. And, you know, you're sympathetic, but they don't really kind of touch you. And then, of course, you know, after a few months, you know, you're that stressed out person who's into, you know, getting caught up in dramas. So it's just understanding ourselves and how we're operating in the world and actually being kind to ourselves and having a bit of sense of humor about ourselves, I think, in those situations, because that's easier to lift ourselves out of it if we can kind of look at ourselves and tease ourselves rather than, getting out the bony finger and making ourselves feel guilty.
Yeah. It's important to be kind to yourself when when you're not having the best of days or emitting the best energy around you.
Definitely.
Yeah. How often do you practice it? Because I'm thinking it can be difficult to make plans with friends. And
Yeah.
if your sacred place is a little out of the way from where you are, perhaps every single day is not viable. So how often would you recommend?
No. Well, I have layers of sacred places, like for me, the street parallel to mine with that I described as a green cathedral. And at the other end of it is a Woolies supermarket around the corner. So there's 3 or 4 ways I could go to the supermarket, but, that's my way because it brings me joy more than the others. And that's because of the trees. I am addicted to trees. So it's bringing nature closer to us so that we do start to notice things like trees close by in our neighbourhood. We have some very old paperbarks very close by because I'm in an old inner city suburb in Sydney. And those trees are just like something out of a fairy tale. They're so old and gnarled. So it can be a jasmine bush that you see on the way up to the train every year, or the magnolia tree that comes out once a year with the most dazzling white flowers. Or it may be a little dandelion pushing through the cracks of the pavement. So it's actually about taking joy in the greenery close by you, saving up for those peak experiences at those peak places, which, as you say, might be out of town or whatever. And I think it's the same with friends. There are certain people we always love to connect with, but living as we do in cities with busy lives, often we might only see them 3 or 4 times a year. Or so I do stuff like joint experiences, like inviting those people to theatre with me as well, so I see them more, to things I think they'd like. We go together, or a movie together, or sacred coffees together. So I try to keep the socializing very simple, picnics, all those things that mean it's more spontaneous for everybody, because I do think we get caught up in having to do perfect. And if we can't, particularly now with all the food shows and, if we haven't plated it perfectly, people are going to, dissolve into complete unhappiness and, which is just not the case. So, yeah, it's just keeping these little rituals so easy that they're, like tomorrow morning we have a local market and we meet 2 dear friends. They're there nearly every Saturday and we have a coffee early before the weekend gets off and we all go off in our many different directions. So, yeah, it's those little moments, I think, we find that that do the trick, that rather than us trying to create this huge circus around us, which is very exhausting. And then we get resentful and it doesn't go well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think sometimes when you have to set up a schedule for these kinds of things and don't just embrace the spontaneity of it, it can end up being a bit more of a stressor than it is,
Yeah.
the
Well, it
sacred
starts to
space that
feel
it's meant to be.
absolutely, and it starts to feel like homework, doesn't it? And then who wants homework? We've all got enough deadlines
Exactly.
and things we're doing anyway. So
Absolutely, exactly. How do you feel that this practice impacts your happiness or your perception in life?
it impacts both. It gives me that deeper sense of peace. It gives me a sense of well-being. It gives me a sense of connectedness to others. So I find I'm more able to connect with those that are different, very different from me. And I find it's given me the confidence to say hello to strangers, particularly older people who often get forgotten. You know, they're the invisible ones. So I always try to make a practice. I mean, obviously not in a busy city street, not unless you were perhaps sitting at a bus stop together, but locally, I do make a practice of always trying to say hello in a way that feels welcoming to the elderly or anybody who's disabled or a bit different. Somebody who you guess might be perceived as being outside, you know, who might feel a bit different themselves for whatever reason. So that's really important for me to kind of spread the love. And I think that's what it's about, is spreading the love. And there's something very joyous about that, because what I notice, particularly with elderly people, particularly elderly men, because they're the ones who are most ignored, the complete surprise on their face that someone has said hello to them and has noticed them. And when you see that, that touches something deep inside you, and it just grows your humanity a little bit. So it does make me feel, my husband's always rolling his eyes and saying, you know, Maggie's never met a stranger. And I do feel a bit that way, because this is what these practices, and I feel that with nature. I feel that with if I see a little ant or a butterfly or a bush I haven't noticed before, I feel I am part of them through this practice over the years. And it's a wonderful feeling of belonging to all these things. And to feel, I mean, sadly we never had children, but to feel that all the children in the world are my children. And so it gives us a profound sense of belonging. So we don't have to worry about, you know, am I alone? There's no time to be lonely in that kind of environment. I'm not saying I don't ever feel at a loose end. Of course I do. I have dark nights of the soul. I have times of deep grief. You know, I've had a year of grief with losing a couple of very important family members. But these things feed us and they carry us through the dark nights of the soul. So we don't try to avoid the difficult stuff in life. We embrace it, and that makes us stronger and more able to face the headwinds that each of us face in our lives, because we're always going to face them. You know, if we didn't want that, we shouldn't. This is the wrong planet. You know, we've come to the wrong planet if we don't want challenges, you know. But it's finding ways to be equal to them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really beautiful way of looking at it. Based on your experience, are there any other practices or habits that you recommend in combination with this one?
Yeah. So I think it's really important to have a number of passions that we indulge. Now, we can't be, you know, you don't want to be out doing a class every night of the week, but the Danes are one of the happiest people on the planet. And there's a wonderful book called The Year of Living Danishly. And it's a London magazine journo who goes to live in Jutland because her husband's got a job with Lego. And so suddenly she's freelancing but has a lot of spare time. So she decides to kind of explain Danish life to the rest of us. And it's screamingly funny in some places and quite profound in others. And one of the things that really blew her away about the Danes is that most of them belong to around five interest groups. Now, that might feel like a lot, particularly if we haven't, you know, kind of thought about indulging things we're passionate about, whether it's playing the ukulele, you know, bushwalking, whatever it is, doesn't matter. But it makes a lot of sense, because then you are meeting people who have your passion, and we know that difference is really good for us. People who are very different from us are good for us. You know, we don't go on holiday, generally speaking, to be with people just like us. We go to have a different experience. So by actually having different interest groups, we have different clusters of people who have our passions, so we have that in common, we have that shared bridge, but who bring all this diversity to our lives. And suddenly you find that life is a whole lot more interesting than sitting at home streaming and ordering Uber Eats or whatever, however you order your food. So that I think is really important, is to, and I have a wonderful friend in Brisbane, and she'd come out of a terrible breakup. And she said to me, Maggie, this year, it wasn't this year, it was a few years ago, I'm just going to do a different group of passions during the year. And she ended up, she's a dentist and works a lot with Indigenous communities in remote locations. She ended up falling in love with the ukulele. And she said, this is crazy. She said, this is the last thing. But she said, I do quite like the sound of the ukulele. And she goes off to ukulele conventions and stuff and has a ball. So, it's all this juiciness is there waiting for us just to dip our toes in the water.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that's such that's such a cool thing that finding a hobby that you never expected to enjoy, but it kind of just ends up
No.
being your thing. Yeah.
How fabulous is that? And then life is the adventure it's meant to be.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That's so true. But that does bring us to the end of our experiment debrief. And hopefully, this is something our audience can take in mind and implement into their own lives if they're struggling with loneliness. But I guess our next segment now is our audience questions, in which I throw you some questions that they've sent in. Are you happy to answer them?
Absolutely.
Fantastic. So the first question is, how do I convince my social anxiety to be okay around people?
So I think the thing is to realize that other people have exactly this, have anxieties just like we do. We always tend to think that, whatever we're dealing with, we're the first person and only person in the world dealing with it. But we're actually playing from very old scripts. From time immemorial, people have struggled with these issues. So in a sense, rather than, sometimes we make the mistake of wearing things that are difficult as our identity. That is only a small part of us, our social anxiety. So how about allowing for the day that you will feel the feelings around social anxiety, and you'll dip your toe in the water anyway. So this is not ignoring it. It is actually saying, okay, this is who I am. This is a bit scary, but I'm going to have a go at it anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. It's embracing that fear.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And being kind to yourself about it. Not being judgmental about yourself, but there's a good thing also is to talk to oneself like you'd talk to a small child. Talk to fears like you talk to a small child in a reassuring tone. I know you're feeling X, Y, and Z, but you know what? It might just turn out to be great fun. So let's do it anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like that's my favorite piece of advice that anyone's ever given me. The next question is moving to a new city is scary because I know that I won't have anyone there and I'll be feeling alone. How do I combat that if I know that's the best thing for my career?
Yes, and look, this is I'm so glad you've asked this question, because I think I really feel for the people who moved to cities they didn't know during COVID, because, one of the great places to make friendships, of course, is the workplace. But the thing is to reach out, and again, do it very, very simply. So if there's somebody in your workplace, and let's say you haven't been in the office much or not at all, and you just seem to gel, why not just say to them, I love it, when we have these, little Zoom chats about work. I love your sense of humor or whatever. I'd love it if we could catch up for a cup of coffee. And the thing is to choose something simple so that if the other person might be, for all we know, suffering social anxiety, then that's signaling a half hour of your time, an hour if it goes well. That's manageable, and then from there it may be dinner or whatever. But I would really suggest reaching out to people at work. I would definitely get to know the people in the village around where you are, so that you get to know the barista, you get to know the person in the chemist, and you know their name, and you know they've got a dog and they've got 2 small grandchildren, and the fruiterers, and the person at the post office and the florist, whoever. So you actually get to know them. You'll make their day by taking an interest. You only need to know 2 or 3 things about them. They might be the mad ukulele person that you've been dying to connect with, to meet with a local group. So that when you connect, you go for your daily coffee or whatever, you have created a friendship with those people, and they feel seen and heard too, because too often people go in and, my 2 cafes that I frequent, it's so interesting how some people go in there and treat these people like servants, and they don't know their names. They're not interested. They just want what they want. So do that. And then I would reach out to a neighbor who you feel you gel with. And again, a cup of coffee, not at your place, but a local cafe, and take it from there. And I think people really appreciate when somebody makes the effort to reach out, because they feel that's important. And then to drop them a note and just say, I really love that. Thank you for your time. Because that's another thing we don't tend to do, is to thank people for their time and express how much we've enjoyed being with them. And another thing I think is going to the local farmers markets, because they're always joyous places. So that creates what I look at in the book, those times of being alone together, where you're actually by yourself. But because it's so buzzy and joyful, you actually feel part of everything. The mum with the 2 dogs and the child in the push, chair and all that. You feel part of all those people because it's such a vibrant thing happening around you.
Yeah, absolutely. Farmers markets are always positive energy. I always find that come from those.
Definitely.
Final audience. Yeah, absolutely. Final audience question. And this is a really, really good one. Why do I still feel lonely even if I'm surrounded by friends?
This is a very good question. I would say, are you surrounded by the right friends? And often we chase friendships because people are glamorous and exciting, or they're trendier than we are, and we kind of want to be in that vibe, or, the it group or whatever. We're not actually with people who are feeding our soul, people who perhaps share our real values, not the adopted ones. And you know what? We don't need many real friends in our life to feel nourished. And what I would say is, one of the powerful things also is to have a friendship with somebody who's 1 or 2 generations older than we are. And I have to say, those friends through time have nourished me, often in ways that younger friends couldn't, because they've got a wisdom, they've got a peace, they've got a vibe about them where, they've been there, they've had cancer, they've had people die, they've been retrenched from work, etc., etc. They're still here. So they're able to provide us with a calm and a wisdom that we wouldn't otherwise have. So I would say, be sure it's the friends, they're real friends, and have friendships across the generations.
Yeah, absolutely. Really, really good advice. But that's it in terms of the audience questions. That brings
Lovely.
us to the end of
brings us to the end of our show. Was there anything that, really quick, that you wanted to mention that you feel we haven't covered so far in the episode?
I'd like to reiterate something that was mentioned very briefly as a takeaway, and that is to dare to do the difficult things so they become easy for us and they make us strong. And, you know, when we're in a lonely place, we're in a vulnerable space. But when we come out of that, we're moving into a place of strength. And strength is what carries us forward in life, along with all those other wonderful things of being able to relate and have a sense of humor. So don't step back when it's difficult. Feel those uncomfortable feelings and do it anyway.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because
really
it's
good
a path
advice.
to strength and courage.
Yes, definitely. I'll be probably having some takeaways from that myself. But Maggie,
Great.
where can our audience find you?
Look, if they, pardon me, would like to go to my website, it's maggiehamilton.org, or by email. I mean, I have a Facebook page, but by email, contact@maggiehamilton.org.
Fantastic. It's been such a joy for me to talk to you today. I've had a really great time. Thank you so much for joining me.
And go well.
You've been listening to Sero Boost, the Happiness Science Insights podcast, produced by the Happiness Science Labs, a division of LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes are available from 10 life management perspectives and can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, and other podcasting apps available on your devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, share, and subscribe to our channel so that other people can find it and we can continue to provide quality content. More of our work can be found on our website at ha.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Lu Ngo. Thanks for tuning in.